started. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to have you in class today. Today, we're going to do an introduction to the idea of assembly and petition in our country. That means we're going to look really closely at the First Amendment and that clause that really gives the power of the people to gather together and to petition their government when they want something different or changed. So my name is Kerry Sautner. It's great to have you all in class today. During class today, we want you to ask lots of questions. We love questions. So feel free to use the chat or the Q&A, and I'll put lots of links in there as well. Today, I'm here with one of our top scholars at the National Constitution Center, Tom Donnelly. Tom, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Can't wait to dig into this topic.
Now, Tom, before we kind of dig in and look at what really is assembly and petition, before we start a class, we both said this is our favorite topic. Why is it your favorite topic? What is it about the assembly and petition clause of the First Amendment that you think it has so much power?
I think so much of it is the rich history of the rights and how they've been used over time. Now, there's a certain way in which we don't always, when we think of the First Amendment, these aren't the first rights that spring to mind. But these rights have been absolutely essential to people that didn't have formal voice, that didn't have formal power, that were disadvantaged and fighting for a better country and a better constitution, whether it's African Americans, women, abolitionists in the 1800s, the civil rights movement, which we see here in the 20th century. All of these groups use the right to assemble and petition to make us a better country.
Yeah, I love, that's perfect. And I think that's why it is so powerful, because it really is, like, as you look at it, that section of the First Amendment, it's very clear that it's for everybody. This is a tool for everybody in this country to use and find ways to have voice and agency to make change. And that's why I think we get the best stories in this. There's a lot of people fighting for their rights to make our world better, or our country better for all of us. So it's really interesting. So as we dive into it and we look at assembly and petition, I'm going to start off with the basic clear things. What does it mean to assemble? What does it mean to petition? Like, what does that look like?
Sure. And yeah, I was going to say, why don't we'll put the text of the Constitution up on the screen, and we always begin with the text. And so it's, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now, I think the best way to read this text is it's really protecting two distinct rights. So when we say assemble, what does that mean? What do we envision? Well, this is really when you gather together with other people. It could be a parade, it could be a religious meeting, it could be a political meeting, it could be a strike. You know, all of these different forms of collective action we take to present our views to our fellow citizens and to our government. And then the petition right is, so it comes from a similar place in that it's a way where you have a formal mechanism where you can write out your complaints, your ideas, send it to the government, and the government, you know, has to looks at them, listens, and these will often be things that you're complaining about, things that aren't the way you want them to be. You have ideas about how to make the country a better place, and it's a formal way that we can present those ideas to the government.
So just remember, students, if you need to petition your teacher, they are technically, if it's in a public school, a government agent. You have a right to petition your teacher. And maybe at home, I don't know if you have a right to petition your parents, but at least say, you know, the National Constitution Center says I should really kind of practice my rights. And so I'm going to petition you with my grievances. So I love that idea. I love that it gives power and agency and voice to make sure your government hears. But you said something really interesting. The government reads it. So this is an expectation that when the people give a petition to the government, that they will read this petition clearly. And so there's always somebody reading these.
Well, that's certainly the vision behind the right. I mean, it is a right. Both assembly and petition are interesting because they're really, really old rights. They're before the revolution, before our country. They go back to Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. And so these are very old rights that are meant to, the petition right in particular, link our views, our opinions, our grievances directly to the government. So the government has to listen. And petition is also great from the perspective of the dissenter, in that it often forces you to think clearly, soberly, and really try to, in a concrete way, present your ideas in writing, which can be a good mechanism both for clarifying your own views, but also making sure that they're there to be read by government officials.
So do we wanna dive into like kind of the history and like where did the ideas come from before the First Amendment was written?
Sure. Yeah. Let's start. This is a great example of William Penn. Now, this, if we're thinking especially about the assembly right here occurring, as James Madison and the First Congress are putting together the First Amendment, this is one of the key incidents that they had in mind. So this is William Penn. It's the arrest of William Penn. We're in England. It's the late 1600s. William Penn himself, he's a Quaker. Of course, he'd go on to found Pennsylvania, but Penn and his Quaker friends, for the king and the Church of England, they weren't thrilled with having them in England. They were often very critical of the religious establishment, critical of the crown. And so there was a law in place in England at the time. So this is in the 1660s, 1670s. We have the Church of England. It's the official church of the nation. It's run by the king. And there's a law in place saying that we are banning religious gatherings for those over 5 people if it's outside of the Church of England. And so William Penn, despite this law, gets together with his Quaker friends. They have a Quaker meeting. They worship together. They have a religious assembly in violation of the law. And Penn is arrested. He's arrested. He's put on trial. He's violated the letter of the law. There's no doubt about that. He is acting illegally under English law, but the jury refuses to convict him. Even though the letter of the law Penn violated, they refuse to convict him. They think a conviction in this case would be unjust. The judge even tries to force the jury to change his mind, saying you must convict. He violated the law. The jury refused. And then we have William Penn here crying out to the jury as the jury's denying the judge. He says, "You are Englishmen, mind your privileges, give not away your right." And so here we see this amazing fusion of a right of speech, of assembly, of religious liberty, all in this one example. But when we're thinking of like the core case for the assembly right for James Madison and his fellow founders, this would certainly be one of the first ones that would spring to mind.
And they are really intertwined, this idea that you get to gather together with your fellow like-minded people and be able to believe what you want to believe. And that judge, he really tried to force that jury. Like, didn't he put them in jail and like not feed them for like days?
Oh, correct. Yes.
Yeah. So it wasn't like, I really want you to.
Oh, no. Using like the formal powers of the court to really try to coerce the jury to change its views.
And they still stood up and said, this is not right. And jury nullification, which means like null and void in one way what the choices were made. So this idea that you have the right to associate with whom you choose, that's kind of at the foundation of assembly. And we're going to dive into how have people used it in America over time to make change, and the pushback on it as well. So I love Bayard Rustin and Robinson. This is a great picture, but do you want to set this up before we walk into kind of the abolitionist movement?
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I think the thing to realize about assembly, so why this distinct right? Well, it's the one right in the First Amendment that it really, really, really does require more than one person. So you can speak alone, you can't assemble alone. And what we know about assemblies, though, are sometimes you can have an assembly and it'll just arise spontaneously without planning. But quite often, a lot of planning goes into it. You have to form a group. You need to develop bonds with other people. You have to come up with plans. And so over time, the court has said that the assembly right protects a right of association and protects a lot of these activities that lead up to the assembly itself. Now, the court allows some limits on the right of assembly and association. We'll get into those in a little bit, because no right in the Constitution is absolute. But nevertheless, it really does protect a lot of those activities leading up to the assembly. And the last thing to remember is that it really is, the assembly right, it can be a distinct form of expression. So, if you're gathering in a parade, or if you're gathering in a protest, the actual act of gathering, that vision of people gathering together is more powerful sometimes than any specific message on a sign, any particular chant that the assembly is doing. And so, like, even if you don't have a printing press, you're not a great writer, you're not a great speaker, you can still join together with your fellow people who unify around a big idea, and your very presence, your very activity, your very gathering together is that powerful message.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. I was reading an article last week about the First Amendment, and there's the writer said, don't forget the power of gathering. The power of gathering visibly in front of the rest of the world is a statement within itself. That is speech within itself. Okay, So let's look at some great gatherers to make change. So diving into the kind of the abolitionist movement. And again, speech and press and gatherings and petitions, these are all really together. But let's look kind of closely at assembly first, and then we're going to dive into some of the first petitions still around this topic of ending slavery.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so, like, abolitionists, we think of them today as one of the heroes of the American constitutional story. But the thing to remember is that in the 1800s, they were really, really, really unpopular. We think of them as so clearly right today, but their contemporaries, not just in the South, but in the North, thought they were wrong. But even worse than being wrong, they thought they were dangerous. Why were they dangerous? Because of their message. The fear was that, the most obvious one, maybe enslaved people are going to hear this message, take it seriously, and demand freedom. But apart from even that, there was also a fear that the abolitionist message, arguing for the end of slavery, was going to divide North against South in Congress, across the nation, and might rend us in two, that there was something really dangerous about what abolitionists were doing. And this included abolitionists meeting to speak their messages, but meeting also to plan their activities. And so we see, both in the North and the South, all sorts of actions taken to shut down abolitionist meetings. Especially in the South, we actually see this written into law. We see laws in the South that ban abolitionist speech, preaching, and assembly. And then all throughout both the South, but especially in the North, where there's more abolitionist activity, where law doesn't work, we see community leaders, political leaders joining together to put together mobs to shut down abolitionist meetings, speech, and press. This could lead to violence. This could lead to murder, which we saw with Elijah Lovejoy in 1837, the abolitionist printer, and great danger for these courageous abolitionist voices. But what we know is that despite these laws, despite these threats, despite a sense that what they're saying is undermining America from many of the opponents of abolitionism, they kept meeting, they kept speaking, they kept preaching, they stood up to the violence, and in the end, they end up winning this debate. We end up with the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. But it's a reminder that often this push for change requires embracing many of your constitutional rights, including those under the First Amendment, like the right of assembly, and being willing to fight for them and continue to speak in the face of violence and even the threat of murder.
And so, and just to clarify for our students, we have written in the First Amendment, you have the right to assemble together, but states could write laws that said you can't assemble together in this state for this reason. What? And why doesn't the First Amendment work on kind of that state level?
Well, there are two things to that, Kerry. One is the Bill of Rights, as originally written and ratified, only applies to the national government, not to the states. It's only with the 14th Amendment that we see the First Amendment rights expand into state abuses. So that's after the Civil War into the 20th century. So the Bill of Rights itself isn't applying in this situation. But we see even in southern states at this time, there are state constitutions that apply these rights. And so the arguments under the law here are that, no right is absolute. This sort of speech can undermine the health, safety, and welfare of the residents of our state. And so we can regulate things that are going to incite or possibly cause violence. And what can be more violent than abolitionist rabble-rousers coming down south and speaking, what we think of as truth about the evils of slavery? I was going to
say freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
Freedom.
Yeah.
So it is pretty fascinating to think this flipped on its head, that the people that we think of are our greatest American heroes, that are, people fighting for their freedoms and their rights, as well as abolitionists supporting others for freedom and rights, are the ones who are being said that they are the dangerous ones. They are the ones that are trying to corrupt our America, our society. And so we look at the abolitionist meetings, but we also have the African American conventions going on as well, and calling for change and calling for these freedoms and changes in the Constitution. Can you kind of walk us through these great movements and these great people?
Yeah, these are absolutely amazing. And I urge you, if you want to look for yourself, the University of Delaware has put petitions and records from these conventions online. So you can actually see what these conventions had to say. But these are gatherings of African Americans before, during, and after the Civil War. And these are people getting together and trying to come up with a vision of what a truly free and equal America is going to look like. And so these are literally just meetings that will then frequently, it's a great fusion, Kerry, of the assembly right and the petition right, because you're using your right to assemble to assemble in conventions. So for instance, there was powerful conventions in South Carolina after the Civil War, where a lot of these assemblies get together in South Carolina, free African Americans after the Civil War. They come together and they say, what are the rights we most value? They'll frequently say religious liberty, free speech, assembly, the right to keep and bear arms. These would all be in these petitions. They'd send these petitions to Congress, and then you'd have key people like Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts read them on the floor, read them before the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, and really offer a vision of what post-Civil War America should look like. And we see here, Frederick Douglass was often part of these conventions. He gave a famous speech in 1860 in Boston, where he was really focusing on the importance of both free speech and the assembly right, and arguing that those mobs that we just talked about against the abolitionists are at their core anti-American. They go against the Declaration of Independence. They go against our most cherished liberties, and that we need to value the right to dissent and to make our country a better place.
And so I think it's fascinating. So these petitions, so everybody would gather, they would say, this is what we need in our Constitution. We're calling for change. We're calling for the promise of the Declaration to be written into the Constitution. They would sign it. And that's what I always think of when petition, is I think of like lifting above my grievances and then a whole bunch of signatures. And then they would give it to Congress, and then members of Congress would read it. And the cool part about that, I think, is awesome, is as they're reading them out loud, they go into the record. They go into the record of Congress. But why? So why are they petitioning Congress? Because they're calling on Congress to write new laws, to come up with an amendment. So is this kind of like why it goes to Congress directly, so then there can be action taken through the law?
Yeah, because if you're thinking before the Civil War, it's African Americans who often want an end to slavery or other sorts of laws that can protect their rights. After the Civil War, we know that the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln and of Union that just won the Civil War, is looking to set new legal baselines for what America is going to look like under the Civil War. That includes constitutional amendments. So things we see, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment ratified after the Civil War, transforming America. Many of those ideas, you look at what's in these convention petitions and you look at what ends up written into and what's at the core of that second founding with those amendments. And you see them in there. So you're looking for new constitutional amendments, or you're looking for new laws that can protect your rights. And so, that's at the core. Again, it's amazing to read these petitions because it's like reading the Declaration of Independence, like reading these petitions. It's the same insofar as going back to first principles and what's absolutely essential to having a free and equal America.
And I know they're two different rights, assembly and petition, but they are so intertwined. This is why you guys are hearing us go back and forth between the two. And we're going to get even deeper into some examples of early petitions in a minute. But I think one of the coolest things that I read was one of the first kind of ideas about the 13th Amendment that goes to Sumner, that goes to Congress, comes from Susan B. Anthony and the suffragist movement, that they petition and say, African Americans are petitioning and they're assembling and they're calling for it. But it's this letter that comes from the women that says we need to end slavery now, that is really kind of kicks off some more energy around it.
Yeah, it's a year before Congress approves the 13th Amendment. It's Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the National Loyal Women's League get together to do this huge petition drive to try to abolish slavery. So it's towards the it's the back part of the Civil War. There's still fighting going on, but what they do is they gather over 100,000 signatures of people who want to abolish slavery. 2/3 of those signatures are women. So keep in mind, why is assembly and petition so important to voices like women's voices? They can't vote. They can't vote right now. So what they're saying is what we can do is we can speak to you representatives and say, this is absolutely essential. And so they have this huge petition drive over the course of the, throughout the country. And then again, they deliver this petition to Congress. And who is it that presents it on the floor of the Senate? But Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who's an ally of many of these women's rights activists, also of African Americans and of the abolitionists. And he himself would say, he was a key force fighting for the abolition of slavery within Congress, would say that this petition drive really helped build a lot of momentum for eventually congressional approval of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and then eventually its ratification.
Awesome. So, and the suffragists were fighting for abolition, but they were also fighting for the women's right to vote. So Alice Paul kind of I always think of her as like the newbie of the women's rights movement, because she comes at it very differently than everybody else. She's like, no, talk about dissent. She says, okay, we're going to assemble, but we're going to assemble in places that they don't want us to assemble, really visual places, and call on the president, call on Congress to make change. So tell us a little bit about Alice Paul, and then we'll get into, the first protest at the White House, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, so Alice Paul, you're right. She represents this period, this point of generational change in the suffragist movement. So these are people who are fighting for the women's right to vote. And so, what I want to say before Alice Paul is that the right to assemble was absolutely essential to the women's suffrage movement before Alice Paul too. Because if we think about the 1800s, what was one of the key activities among women's activists fighting for the right to vote? Conventions. So you have women holding conventions in the 1800s, most famously the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, arguing that we need for women to have the right to vote. And so with the Seneca Falls Convention, that was Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing the Declaration of Sentiments, where she's modeling the women's rights movement after the Declaration of Independence. She borrows from the Declaration and rewrites it as a Declaration of Rights for women, arguing about the different grievances that women had against men, not the king, but also a vision of what an America where women and men are equal, what it's going to look like. So it's the assembly right extends back. With Alice Paul, we see this transition also in the women's suffrage movement to more aggressive advocacy. You're right, Kerry. Let's face it though, like in 1848, it wasn't as though doing the Seneca Falls Convention was, that was courageous too. But Alice Paul, what Alice Paul does, and this is, especially around, so Woodrow Wilson's reelected in 1916. We've seen, more success across a number of states pushing for the women's right to vote, but the 19th Amendment, which will protect the women's right to vote, is stalled in Congress, and so they need to spur new action. And so what Alice Paul says, she gets together with the National Women's Party, and she says, we need to pick at the White House. We need to pick at the White House. On my understanding, the first time this happened is it's Alice Paul and her fellow supporters of the women's right to vote, picketing the White House. Initially, Woodrow Wilson, he sort of tries to have it both ways, I would say, with women's suffrage. And so he'd wave to the activists or whatever as he got into the White House. But then remember, we would enter World War I. Shortly thereafter, this is 1916, then 1917, we enter World War I. And after that, we actually see a crackdown on these women's protesters. Many are arrested. But nevertheless, they continued to protest. And over time, public opinion shifted. Many people were sympathetic to these women protesters being arrested. Woodrow Wilson would eventually come to support the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment would be ratified in 1920. But again, it's a reminder, Kerry, that sometimes really to spur action, it takes really having the courage to take what is seen as quite radical action. And often you will be suppressed for it. You'll often be thrown in jail for it.
And the Night of Terror is one of the stories around the violence for the women protesters. So this is just the fun kind of women's history note. This is the first picketing of the White House. And I'm pretty sure to date, still the largest protest, peaceful protest in America was the Women's March in 2017, because it was nationwide. It wasn't just in DC, it was nationwide. So just a little shout out for the women. And
the other thing, Kerry, is apart from the picketing here, we also saw a series of women parades, suffrage marches throughout this period too. So it's not just the protest in front of the White House, but it's using assembly through parade even during that period, which was also meant to increase support and awareness about women's suffrage.
So fascinating, like this idea of like all these different ways and angles into it. And then, as we talk about women's suffrage in those parades, there are so many stories of also the racism that goes on in the women's movement and the push that African-American women had to do double time, again, to say we want the women's right to vote, but we also want to be treated as equal within the women's movement. So it wasn't like it was perfect. And that's going to lead us kind of into, and then we're going to jump to petition, I promise, after that, into really kind of that energy around the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and the huge push that Assembly made in changing our country's views towards civil rights and voting rights and political rights.
Yeah, no, that's right. And this is a great, so there are this is probably the big case when it comes to, assembly and the civil rights movement, NAACP versus Patterson. The bottom line here is that what we see throughout the South is the greater organization of civil rights groups in many places, many states that didn't want these groups. And states would try, much like they did with the abolitionists in the 1800s, try to use their laws and the powers of the state to shut down these groups, most notably here, the NAACP. And so they would try to attack the NAACP as an illegal organization, saying that they didn't really follow the proper corporation rules in their state. They would try to use state law to get them to have to disclose their supporters, so then those supporters could be harassed. And what the Supreme Court did in NAACP versus Patterson, and a later case in the 1980s called Claiborne Hardware, would say that, in the end, no, you can't use state laws in this context. The right to assembly is absolutely essential to political change, and it needs to be protected. It needs to be protected against harassment like that. And we also have to be able to protect key activities to the civil rights movement, like boycotts. And things like that are associated enough with key First Amendment rights that they get protection.
Awesome. It's so much fun. I can talk about assembly all day. This is why it's my favorite topic, but I don't want to do that because we have 4 minutes left. And I think one of my favorite stories on petition, and I know we've weaved petition in throughout this whole thing, is really on some of the first major movements of petitioning our brand new Congress and our country to talk about and end slavery. And it's really the story of Prince Hall. So can you kind of bring us into this idea of petitioning and how much power? And we don't even think about petition today. We know, like, oh, you can write a petition, you can sign it, and you can petition your government. And I know the White House a few years ago did a huge change on online petitions and it made a big impact. But petitions were powerful throughout American history. And this is probably one of my favorite stories around early petitions and really calling for change.
Yeah, Prince Hall, he's a free African-American. This is in the 1770s. He helped forge an active community of free African-Americans in Boston during this period, and he was a relentless petitioner. And so why do we have petitions then? Now think about today. How does the government hear from, the people more broadly? Often one link is political parties, which we didn't really have back then. The other is public opinion polling, which we didn't have back then. So one way to think about the petition power is it really is a way of trying to express local conditions and public opinion to those in power. And so Prince Hall here began a campaign in 1773 to petition the Massachusetts state legislature to get rid of slavery. And so remember, we often think of slavery as just a Southern phenomenon. Well, we have slavery in the North, including even in Massachusetts. And so what Prince Hall does here is, he begins this petition drive in 1773, but then something happens in 1776. We declare independence. We declare that we have we're all created equal and we have unalienable rights. And so what Prince Hall does is he takes the promise of freedom and equality in the Declaration of Independence that says, he has a new petition and he says, Massachusetts legislature, slavery is inconsistent with this. It's inconsistent with the very core of Americans. So he joins together with 7 other free African Americans saying, end slavery now here in Massachusetts. And so this is, I don't want to only single out Prince Hall. Prince Hall is really, really important. There are other African American petitions in Massachusetts during this time, similarly calling for the end of slavery. And you know what's amazing? It actually worked. It worked. We see the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1783 declaring slavery in Massachusetts unconstitutional, saying it was against the Declaration, it was against natural law, which is what Prince Hall says here, and it was against the Massachusetts Constitution. And so it's a reminder that this petition power really could spur important change and important conversations.
And that was Riley's question, which I loved, which was, have petitions turned into law or made significant change? So can you give us do you have an example of any one that has changed national law? One might say like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton tried to begin with the 13th Amendment, and that kind of gave energy to it. But are there any kind of other big ones that come to mind, Tom?
I think that, so like what you also have from Stanton and Anthony in the, and their allies in the late 1800s is they're also petitioning Congress for women's suffrage. And so whereas there's a lag time, obviously, between then and 1920 when we ratify, this continuing push through petition, through testifying, through all of that clearly continued to build momentum for that particular cause. I mean, I think I think one real example is if we're thinking about creating the 13th, but especially the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. You have the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which is kind of a second constitutional convention. They're members of Congress trying to come up with what kind of amendments we should write and then ratify. And this is where, so many of them are here. They're reading these petitions and having testimony from African Americans throughout the South. And African Americans are talking about how they're being mistreated and which rights they demand. And those rights were absolutely at the core of what the framers and ratifiers of the 14th Amendment wrote into the Constitution through that, through that series of powerful amendments. So I think that's one where the link is pretty,
I love
pretty
that
tight.
One. Yeah, and that's perfect because it's showing the voice of the people saying, this is our lived experiences and this is the change we're calling for, and that it gets the kind of the energy and the refining of the amendment to be clear. Now, as we kind of look at the right to petition against slavery, the right to petition against the women's rights movement, we need to wrap up in this power. But I guess the one kind of end thing I would ask you about assembly and petition is, as we look at assemblies across America, from parades to protests, and we look at the idea of petition, is there something we should almost be keeping our eyes on the prize, like something's coming down the road, some kind of idea or some kind of lens to look at them through?
That's a good question, Kerry. I mean, I think mostly, if there's one thing we can contribute with this class, I think it's I hope that it'll get you to see assembly and petition everywhere as you study history, as you study contemporary politics, because it's one that they're not rights that we talk about as much, but they're absolutely essential. And the last thing to note, Kerry, because we didn't get to it with assembly, is to remember there's a balance when you're understanding both the history and the law, where it has been absolutely essential to change over time. If we're thinking about assembly today, it remains really, really important. But we should remember that when we're talking about assembly rights, they are not absolute. And so there is always a balance and a question that we have to ask between, when can the government sometimes restrict assembly for purposes of promoting maybe order or safety? And this goes back to what we talk about so often, which are these time, place, and manner regulations, where we really say the government, you can't keep certain messages from being spoken, but what you can do, sometimes you can regulate when they can be spoken and how loudly. So that could be to make sure people can sleep at night, to make sure, kids can learn in school and things like that. So there are certain, or, maybe you need a permit before you can have a parade, so we can have a police presence there to sort of keep order, and also make sure we don't have more than one person trying to parade at the same time. So there are reasonable regulations like that, but the government can't use those regulations as an excuse to suppress poor stewardship.
And I think that's awesome. And now I want to make sure we add in something like Westboro Baptist Church cases, because that's looking at where protests can happen, how far away from certain areas protests can happen. And even our buildings on Independence Hall, when you look out over front of the building at the National Constitution Center, there's a big giant square, and it's the First Amendment square. And you can protest there, or you can have a religious prayer there. You can do so many things there, but you do have to fill out a permit. You can't just show up. You do have to ask for that space. And partly because they don't want everybody there at the same day and not be organized. So it's kind of fascinating, but this has been a great class. We're going to look for assembly and petition everywhere now. And remember, read before you sign the petition, but still it's a great tool and it has power in our country. So thank you so much, Tom.
All right. Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, students. Great classes today. I'm going to stop the official. There we go.